To give the hard task of being our last substantive speaker to Tom Healy, although I'm sure he's absolutely going to rise to that challenge. Tom.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to respond to the very valuable research work that has been presented here. I must confess that I hadn't been aware of this research until comparatively recently. And I look forward to having an opportunity to go through the paper. And for those of you who are particularly interested, the full paper, including an appendix of equations, is available outside. And the version which I've so far read is on one page, so that you might also be interested in that. And I'd like to begin actually by quoting one sentence from the summary sheet, because I think it's actually quite significant, and we shouldn't maybe lose the point, because it's a very provocative and courageous suggestion, if I may say so. And it says that Europe needs a system of European wage bargaining coordination that aims at wages growing at least with productivity growth and the inflation target in the long run. However, the next sentence is really interesting. This requires institution building at the national as well as the European level. And let's stop and think about that for a second, because it has profound implications for institutions of collective and wage bargaining here in this jurisdiction, but also at a European level. And I may have missed it, but I don't hear any substantial conversation going on about coordinating wages at the European level, let alone at the national level, because certainly we're in something of a free-for-all at the moment, at this point anyway, in our economic recovery, with a proposed wage deal in the public sector, which covers about 20% of the workforce, but basically a very uneven and a very complex evolving situation in the private sector. Move that to the European theatre, and you're looking at huge challenges, but this is a good question to ask nonetheless, because if some commentators are interested in moving towards a coordinated monetary and fiscal policy, I guess the next question you could ask is, well, could that have implications for wage policy? The answer is yes, but then how do you coordinate a wage increase across a very diverse set of 28 member states, from Estonia to Luxembourg, to Ireland, to the UK, with very, very different labour market institutions and a very different structure and makeup in terms of wages. The other striking thing about this work, I think, is that it does draw our attention to the role of wages in sustaining domestic demand. And this may seem like an obvious point, but when you think about it again, when wages are discussed in Ireland, particularly in relation to wage levels in other countries, the standard view is, well, you know, we got to watch competitiveness and can't pay ourselves any more than the Germans pay themselves. And it's entirely couched in terms of cost competitiveness. So I think the benefit of this research is that it does actually broaden the discussion to looking at aggregate demand. And then it becomes very interesting when you hypothecate, or when you actually form the hypothesis, I was looking for the verb there, hypothesis anyway, of a coordinated wage increase across Europe. You get a kind of a joined-up effect where no one member state can beggar thy neighbour in terms of dumping or cutting their wages at the expense of the competitiveness of other countries. It works together in tandem, and it does have the effect of pulling up aggregate demand within that particular trade area or that particular group of European countries. However, you do have to ask the question, is there a modest possibility of this happening anytime in the next few months, let alone the next few years? And in terms of answering that question, I think we have to be realistic and realize that that's not going to happen. But it's a good question to raise. It's one that I think we need to keep looking at and raising, because certainly the possibility or the desirability of a wage recovery in Germany, which has a significant trade surplus, has been raised no less by the Bundesbank, one of their board members at least. So there is actually an awareness that in addressing some of these internal imbalances as well as deficiency in aggregate demand in countries such as Germany, the impact of that on the periphery and other European member states and Eurozone countries is very significant. Now, just to say a little bit about Ireland, because somewhere in the report, obviously, Ireland appears. We've seen some of the empirical data there. And underlying all this, I think, is 6 equations, isn't that right? So that this is the basis of the whole thing. However, when you look at the specific case of Ireland, it gets a little bit complicated, obviously, in real world terms. And just let me quickly kind of trace through what I understand happened in the last 15 years or so. There was a significant growth in nominal wages in the years leading up to the crash, 2008, roughly in line with productivity. I was a little bit surprised that the wage share went up from 50 to 60%, but that obviously is based on the Amico data. I didn't think it had gone up that much in those years. And then in 2008, the bottom fell out of the construction industry. There was a beginning of a period of wage cuts in some sectors and in some firms. It was slow at first, but then it spread, particularly in the public sector, but also many private sector firms as well. And the contraction in wage income was largely, a lot of it anyway, was in a reduction in working hours. The interesting thing about the experience of the Irish recession from 2009 up to 2013 is the extraordinarily positive performance of exports of goods and services, especially services actually. And then when you look at those sectors, actually wages were increasing, which is really interesting because the narrative is, oh, Ireland took the pain, did austerity, cut wages, we became more competitive, exports boomed, and away we went. And it's not at all as simple as that, because when you start dissecting into the different parts of the Irish economy, you get a rather different picture. Now, very quickly, there are about 1.5 million workers, employees in Ireland. Leave aside self-employed for the moment. About 350,000 of them are in the public sector, which is largely what we call a non-traded sector. And that's the sector that took the biggest hit in terms of wage cuts. And of course is covered by heavily by union representation and collective agreements in relation to wage increases or decreases, as the case may be. Then there's a huge number, approximately 900,000 employees in small and medium-sized enterprises, many of which are not particularly export-orientated at all. Some of them are. Some of them, for example, in the agri-food business area, would be exporting a lot into the UK market. And they're particularly vulnerable to movements in exchange rates and also wage cost differences as well, and that would be a bigger share typically of their value added. So wage cost issues are probably important in some of those small and medium-sized enterprises. In the large multinational sector, roughly 150,000 employees, wage costs are actually a very small proportion of gross value added. A lot of the turnover of the total production is actually imported as material or inputs or purchasing of royalties in the case of service sector firms. So in fact, this begins to throw some light on why a wage increase in the IT sector, in pharma, in other exporting services, didn't seem to matter actually in terms of Irish export performance in those particular cases. So I'm giving you a rather complex and very multi-layered picture, beginning in a very crude way of the Irish economy. So even within a national context, it's actually quite difficult to figure out how to coordinate a wage recovery because you've got different pressures in terms of supply and demand. You've also got a situation, of course, where compositional effects are happening in the workforce. Managers and professional occupations have seen significant wage recovery in the last 2 to 3 years, whereas production workers, retail service workers have seen a fall in their real wages. Now, this is only over a period of 2 to 3 years. So within the workforce, there are important shifts and changes happening. Is it possible to coordinate all that? I suspect it's going to be very difficult to devise a one-size-fits-all. However, in the absence of some coordination, the risk is that low-paid workers, that workers not in particularly strongly unionized sectors and other areas lose out in terms of the overall economic recovery, and that clearly is not desirable. Okay, so just to maybe come back again to the international level and to ask the question, how is it possible to relate these research outcomes to a discussion at the European level, and particularly to realize the importance of the economies like the German economy that are really important in driving economic activity and business confidence and investment across the whole European Union area. And it seems to me that if we are going to start thinking about wage coordination and some possibility of bringing this into the heart of European debate, we have to then widen the debate even further to look at the relationship between work, taxation and public services. Now, this is not off topic. I'm going in a direction here because all of these things are interrelated. You see, what happened to us over the last 20 years, broadly speaking, the wage share of national income fell in Ireland. That was shown in the presentation. The other thing that happened, which emerged, I think, in this morning's presentations, is that wage inequality increased in Ireland, as well as a fall in the wage share of national income. Put those two facts together, and you begin to understand why market income is so unequal as it is here in Ireland. But that doesn't matter, says the policymakers, because state transfers and state taxes are there to equalize and create a uniform or more equal disposable income. But is that sustainable? Because again, I don't know whether you spotted the irony of this morning when the Taoiseach said, and we have taken yet more workers out of the tax net. And this is what all the ministers for finance said almost every budget back to, I think about 1979, 1978. My memory's getting a bit rusty now. And everyone clapped and said, great, we're helping the poor, we're helping low-paid workers. Why not? Who could be against that? But there's a social contract here which involves a large level of wage inequality and increased wage inequality over time. And then the role of the state in actually effectively subsidizing employers in terms of low pay by ensuring, well, that low-paid employees don't have to pay that much income tax, at least compared to Belgium and Germany and France and similar countries. And then on top of that, the other side of the bargain, if you like to think of it as a social contract bargain, is that we don't tax employers that much, either through corporate tax and certainly not through social insurance. So if we want to talk about a European approach to wage coordination, we're going to have to think about those issues, those other issues as well, because the unique Irish social model that I'm sketching out for you is quite unique and is probably not compatible with this kind of harmonization with Germanic labour market conditions. I'm all for becoming more European and more Germanic, provided that we actually change our taxes, our social welfare, our approach to co-determination, our approach to productivity, our approach to everything actually, and then we'll become more mainstream Europeans. But the thing is, are we courageous enough, are we mature enough to have a debate about that in this country? I suspect we're going to have to see quite a few years before actually the public debate is really clued into that and really brought into that space. So I think many interesting policy questions raised here. And my one final comment is that Tony Atkinson said this morning that he found that economists were actually not that interested in equality issues, and the interest in equality has become less, I think, over time, if I understood correctly what he said, and that certainly does appear to be true. But there is another aspect to this, and that is the interests of economists in wage inequality, as distinct from income inequality. There's a difference, and it seems to me that the interest in wage inequality is even lower again, actually. And you know this, you can prove this, when you actually look up official statistics, because if you can't find official statistics about something, then there's a fair chance that the National Statistical Office, CSO, ONS, are not under pressure to actually collect or publish data on a particular thing. Therefore, you will not find data on wage inequality in this country before 2003. It's quite extraordinary, actually. Thomas Piketty has wage inequality data going back to the early 1900s in most advanced industrial countries. And I actually went and asked labour economists, statisticians. I even went and spoke to retired statisticians from the Central Statistics Office, and I confirmed that there is no data available on wage inequality before 2003. There may be some data in the household budget survey in previous years, but I'm not aware of any published or any extraction of such data. So I'm just drawing attention to the fact that we need to focus on the wage share of national income, the inequality of wages, the total cost of labour, including the employer social contribution, to have a really informed